Recording.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Destreza Lecture Series, Dialogue number 3, where we will discuss Destreza stuff. And as has become tradition, we're going to start with a warm-up where you will rate the following statements from 1 to 5. And 1 means you strongly disagree, and 5 means you strongly agree. Are you ready for the hilarity? I mean, this is going to be so much fun. You're going to wonder why it was that you skipped all the debates. Okay. First question, or first statement, agree or disagree. The role of a Destreza fencing teacher is to teach techniques, systems, and theory that allow you to execute a tradition or system of fencing. A disagreement here, so we've got some fives, but we got a 2 in there from Ken, so he's very suspicious.
We'll dig into that later.
Yeah. All right, let's try this one instead. The role of a Destreza fencing teacher is to provide the student the tools to identify and realize good fencing technique by educating them holistically. Oh, I see some 5s and some 4s. Everybody but Tim, who's throwing a 3 down there. Lois is being contrary. She's not actually throwing a number. All right, how many people think both statements are true? Give me a 1 to 5 on that. Oh, look at that. Everybody likes that one.
Oh.
Except for Ken.
If we can. Can give us a rating on it?
He did. He gave us a 3 on that one.
Thanks, Tim. We're going to have defend your responses coming up right after these questions.
We're not going to attack you, but we are going to do that digitally. Okay, here's another statement. The role of a Destreza fencing teacher is to be able to trash bozos.
Mostly agreement. Or desired agreement, anyway.
Oh, somebody actually got the reference.
Yeah.
To the head. I got the pajamas. Now I want to trash some bozos.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go another one. So the Bolognese method of teaching fencing by using memorized guards and transitional movements from guard to guard is a strong method for teaching fencing.
Oh, Ernesto likes that one. Of course he would, though. I mean, Ernesto, he likes the Darty school. I mean, we can't save everyone. Some people will actually have to burn in eternal hellfire.
I didn't say it's the best way of teaching. I'm just saying it's a good way of teaching.
Okay.
I, of course, also expect the students to know all about Aristotelian time and all of the cultural baggage, too.
There we go. Okay, so how about this one? The Bolognese method of teaching fencing by using memorized guards and transitional movements from guard to guard is inferior to a cause-based approach, which explains the hows and whys of action.
Oh, look at that. We're getting a lot of disagreement there. So some people
would like to dig into that a little bit.
I think we should talk about rote learning. That's interesting. Okay, how about this? When Agrippa streamlined Italian sword theory and made it more cause and theory based, he improved the tradition. Oh, there's a 2 from Ernesto. Got some 4s and some 5s, got a question mark. All right, it's kind of a mixed one.
Yeah.
I think Agrippa's interesting because he's one of the first of a family of reformers who drops onto the scene. He and Vigiani, De Grassi, Carranza, they're all reformers. Okay.
It'd be interesting to see what those guys came up with, like if they had been 200 years later.
Yeah. Why don't you pick up the next one?
Okay, let's see. A fencer needs to know theory as well as technique to be considered a diestro.
Five from everybody except for Lois, who is like, and Tim is like,
Yeah, he was going to be
two.
contrary there. Yeah. Okay.
I think whatever Tim says, he's always going to be the exception that proves the rule. So we're going to take that as universal acclaim.
Just can't say that he agreed with everyone else. Okay, so a fencer needs to have defeated many opponents to be considered a diestro. Not necessarily all at the same time. Disagreement. Diestro without beating people. Well, without beating lots of people.
And everyone disagrees with that statement, mostly except for Tim. Oh, and Russell. All right, I feel like we should probably bring that one back and let that one be discussed, because
I think so.
there is a good conversation to be had about the importance of practical fencing, and whether you should be allowed to teach if you can't walk the walk. Because that's a conversation we're still having.
Okay, so in order to be a good fencer, you must know geometry.
Lois, some of these are actually quotes from dialogue too.
Okay, that's pretty low on the scale. There's a lot of disagreement.
It's funny because the quote is actually, it's the false fencing master saying that he heard that in order to be a good fencer, you need to know geometry, but he thinks geometry is a person. So when Mary translated it, we translated it as geometry. He wants to find geometry and kill him. So that will prove that he is a better fencer than geometry.
I am looking forward to messing around with the second dialogue. I really am.
The false fencing master is hilarious.
Mm.
Oh, okay. Last one on our 1 to 5 scale. Pacheco really is an attractive man.
Are you talking about Jorge or the other Pacheco?
No, the previous Pacheco that we had lecturing, of course he's attractive. I'm talking about Luis Pacheco de Narvaez, of course. We're getting some non-committals here. A lot of people, like Ken thinks he's quite unattractive. Maybe we should have reframed it like, if you were the kind of person who would be romantically interested in Pacheco, would you find him attractive? All right. Ernesto is advocating for mugging Pacheco and stealing his kid in the street. It seems like
Just mugging him would be fine.
people think that he might be attractive until he starts speaking. Huh?
I think that's right.
All right, that's our last 1 to 5 question for our warm-up. But I like how we get through these warm-ups and they sort of expose a cool thing that we can talk about. So I think the first topic we should talk about, okay, can you guys still hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's talk about the difference, the strengths and weaknesses of rote learning versus cause-based learning. What do we think about it?
I mean, I can step in on that one. For me, and this dates back to Kate's presentation, some people learn really well with rote patterns. You give it to them, you let them do things over and over again, and then you refine their as they go. For some people, that does not work. They need to understand the whys. So, like for me, for when I back in high school when I did pottery, I was okay with rote learning because all I needed to know at that point was what I needed to do with the clay, when, and how to make it what I wanted. But for mathematics, when I was doing calculus, I couldn't I had to know the whys, because as I was going through these long processes, so many go haywire, and I needed to be able to come in and take a look at, if I got the wrong answer, why did I get the wrong answer? Where did I go wrong? So for me, and that's why I said that Bakhtinian thing up at the top. For me, I'm all about using things together. What's better than the other is like saying, a car transmission is much, much better than the engine.
Can you unpack the Bakhtinian statement a little bit?
Sure. So when I was doing a doctoral study, I was doing I was focusing on interactive narrative, and to do that, there's two kinds of literature. Earlier literature is very author-driven. So, like, if you take a look at the characters, maybe very compelling and emotionally present, but their behaviors can sometimes feel a bit stilted, like the author is getting them to do what he wants them to do. And the authorial voice is often privileged over character voices. But if you take any Dostoevsky book, that is a Bakhtinian or a dialogic narrative where all of the characters in the story have their own personality, have their own ethical mores, and have their own drives and wishes. And none of them are privileged over the other, and the authorial voice is not privileged over any of them. So the whole interactive narrative thing with what happens if you take a live player and put them into a Bakhtinian story where the characters are no less or more privileged against the wishes of the author and the other characters. So in this case, talking from a Bakhtinian perspective, my view is rote learning absolutely has its place. It has its strengths. It has its own principles that it helps improve. But theoretical learning also has its strengths. And if you let them interact with each other, then you get a greater story from that interaction that is often greater than the sum of its parts. It was a lot of crunch. Very sorry.
No, I liked it. So it kind of opens up another section of dialogue, I think. But let me make a note about it, because I want to delve a little bit. But I also want to keep this conversation open before we delve, so that other people can get some input.
Maybe people have had experience with a rote learning system or setup, and compare that to a teacher-led one or a cause and effect, cause-based one.
So, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so my experience before I was a fencer was as a figure skater and as a dancer. So both of those things are pretty much rote learning. They say, this is how you do a jeté, this is how you do a triple axel, and you practice it over and over and over again until your body just does it. But when it comes to fencing, you're now doing what they call like an open chain activity instead of a closed chain activity, which is what these choreographed activities are, where you do the thing, you do your program. It's exactly the same every time. But when you go to an open chain activity, your brain, a different part of your brain has to engage that tells you what thing needs to be done when and react to your opponent. And you don't do that in figure skating. I mean, maybe in hockey, not in figure skating. So something I've noticed in my training that's difficult for me is I can learn plays all day. I will do exactly what you tell me to do every time. And then you put me in front of somebody who does something different, and my brain goes, what the hell? So that's my experience, is that you have to learn how to combine those things so that you get the rote activity to learn how to do the technique properly. But then you have to do the other side where you do slow work, where you work through these plays or whatever, so that you can then react to what someone else does with the proper technique. Over.
I think there can also be a place where rote learning works on the theoretical level too, in service of having better perception of the causes down the road. In my sort of educational experience to become a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine, you're in acupuncture school for 4 years. and you are learning literally like hundreds of Chinese herbs, and each herb has its own specific properties that are totally unique to any other herb, and you have to know them. And you're learning hundreds of acupuncture points, and each point is in a specific place and has to be needled to a specific depth and a specific direction, and you have to know what other points it interacts with in what way. And it is a colossal amount of theoretical information, and the only way you can even start on that journey is to just memorize, hammer that stuff into your head over and over and over until you have it just on the gut level. And the thing that makes that important in understanding the causes is once you have absorbed that just blunt, dumb information to a certain point, you become capable of seeing connections and deepening into the subject in a way that you can't if you haven't ever, gotten that stuff in there and you're still just going back to the book every time you want to look up an herb or a formula or a diagnosis or whatever it may be. But people who have like pounded that info into their head now are capable of going, oh, and finding these connections and deepening into the material on a much deeper level that then becomes like the whole rest of their practice. So I think to some extent, the perception, when we talk about knowledge, perception, decision, action, perception is best informed by sometimes by that rote coming to grips with the knowledge, as opposed to rote coming to grips with the technique, which is a kind of a separate but intertwined ballgame.
I think that's a really interesting distinction there. In our fencing masters program, one of the things that they go through there is the first year is responsible for all the theory, but not all the practice. And that was the flashcards year. And it was painful to go through at the time, but it was a gift that definitely kept giving for the next several years and beyond, right? As we had the vocabulary and the theory to hang all the new practice that we were doing on. I think that's a really nice insight to see. So what do you think of that compared to something where you're really starting off mostly with just physical, compared to Montante, John, because you've done that in class. You've been through 2 cycles now, right? Or is it 3? And then gone on to the
kind of
sword sections.
I think two of the Montante. Well, I think that's one of the things that's been kind of a challenge for me with Montante is that I'm kind of starting from rote drilled on the technique level, which doesn't really serve that much to inform the knowledge level really at all, especially because the sources that we're working from are rather Spartan in terms of providing insight into the underpinnings of how and why we're doing what we're doing. And so that's where I find myself frustrated with Montante, is trying to look at the sources and say, well, wait a minute, what context is this in? What's the bigger picture? How are these techniques really supposed to work, and why am I doing this? I can memorize the moves, but I feel like at this point I know very little about the why of Montante. Whereas when it comes to side sword and dagger and things like that, I have much better sense of what the why is and the context and the theoretical rationale for doing what I'm doing. And it makes me a lot better to see causes. Of course, with Montante, you don't really have to worry about causes as much because all you have to do is just start swinging, right? And you're pretty much going to be doing all right with the Montante, unless it's another Montante, and then you're back to Destreza. But that's very different, and that has been a challenge.
Has anybody else got thoughts on this? Rote versus theory-based?
Go
ahead.
I mean, I can wait for you because I've already talked a bunch.
Okay, and I missed a little of that as I was finishing food, but the idea brings to mind ages ago, kind of being a fly on the wall when I was starting out in a conversation between Dr. Bill and either Carl Jacobs or James Clock on Italian versus German treatises, in that the Italian ones, and this is before we really had much of the Spanish around, tend to be, here's 40 pages of theory, and now here's plays to show applications of the theory. Whereas the German ones are, here are your Meisterhau, learn your Meisterhau, and then everything will come off that, but that's not the later point. And the point that was being made, I think, was Dr. Bell saying that German style matches medieval pedagogy, whereas the Italians matched Renaissance pedagogy of basically working the physical, the general inward versus theory outward. So both are very useful, but definitely a different way of doing them and a different approach to the styles. And I think it's kind of interesting because I think a lot of later fencing theory, like all of the stuff that the Italian schools, then keep on with the here's your theory, and now we're working off that. Whereas from my experience, which is very limited, a lot of Asian martial arts are taught in that medieval style of here, train on your blows, your punches and kicks for the first several years, and you need to be about black belt level before we start talking theory at all.
I think you've really,
So
I
that's-
shouldn't jump in, but I think you've really put your finger on it, Ernesto, because that medieval style is what Carranza is really criticizing. And the difference between Carranza's ideas about pedagogy and the earlier stuff is really part of that Reformation that we see in people like Agrippa and Vigiani, where they start to introduce theory in a much earlier section. I think you really identified it well.
And I think that's part of why I said with the sorry.
Well, no, I wanted to jump in on the Eastern martial arts thing, because what you were talking about really has me thinking about my Iaido training. And the thing about Iaido training, and I was fortunate enough to study under a school that actually was headed by a Japanese man who had the Honbu back in Japan. Iaido isn't colored as much by the 1970s dojo culture that happened with karate and stuff like that. So the way I learned is an incredibly elegant, unwritten combination of the two things you were talking about. So I walked in not knowing a damn thing. They put a bokdo in my hands and they said, stand in the middle so that when we turn around and do stuff, you have somebody you can watch. Just do the thing. Doesn't matter if you do it badly, just keep doing the thing. We'll come in and check in on you. And so for the first few weeks, my job was just to learn how to do rote actions, doing all the kata, doing all the kumidachi, all the paired exercises, until I started getting a feel for how the weapon should move. And then instructors would identify, I started picking that up. And as we would go, then we'd start talking about how the narrative of a kata tells you what you're and why. So like I studied Muso Shinden Ryu, and the draw involves a really long sword, which you can't just pull, even if it's curved, you can't pull out because it's too damn long. So you have to do something called sayabiki, where you literally crank, you can see my shoulder, you crank back your saya as you draw your sword. I didn't have a saya, I just had a wooden sword that I would tuck into my belt and then pull out. But because I was watching everyone, I knew that I had to crank my hand back. And actually, I understood the whys of why that happened. It's a very interwoven narrative, and that's probably why it really keyed well for me, because it's very narratively set. In a way, it kind of highlights the differences that you were talking about between the Italian and the German, and the medieval and the Renaissance, but also shows how they can interweave together, which sort of strikes me, and I wouldn't have thought about it had you done so.
So Lois, I'm curious to know, how would you take that experience that you had in Iaido, or how have you adapted that to your instruction in Destreza, or how can you, are there any avenues where you could see adapting? What would you bring from that to your instruction in Destreza?
I bring the narrative, like that's something I've thought about a lot, because I struggled. When I started doing Western swordsmanship, I started with a different school called Vanguard, and they are, you remember Scott McDonald, so you know who I'm talking about. He's very practical. He doesn't teach any specific school, but he will teach you the actions that a weapon needs to make in order to stop an attack, in order to execute an attack safely. So he's kind of school agnostic, but he's drawing from all these different historical sources. And it was incredibly difficult for me because I wasn't getting the narrative connective tissue. It was just, here you go. I had no context. So when I started teaching Destreza, which for me was also a learning experience because I was learning as I went too, I would key into the narratives I would build in my head to explain why I was making an action, and then I would put it out loud. So like if I'm teaching cuts, if I'm teaching, a full cut or I'm teaching a reverse, and the impetus that leads you to make those actions, I will actually like play act the role. So I'm like, okay, I've got my student who's going to be my partner. I'm the instructor bit. And I'm like, yeah, I think I'm pretty smart. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to put this really strong atajo on you, but I've made a mistake. I've overcommitted. So what are you going to do when you feel that heavy pressure? And the student's like, going to come around with a transverse and cut you or reverse you. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly it. So the instruction was never delivered in that kind of informal way in my EIDO classes. But that kind of narrative, which I think comes out that, like I just, you kind of absorb that because you get that feeling of, for instance, if I'm going to stop a cut with an atajo, I can often, nope, screw you, nope, and that's a sort of emotional narrative component that I can use to build other reasonable responses within the extended narrative of a play or of a free combat. So I would say it's that narrative connection. I don't know how well I'm explaining it, but
No, I like that. It sounds really. I mean, it's the story, and like that's really good. I like that.
So do you think that do you think that the narrative then is right? So do you think that the narrative is the distinction between rote and just repetition? Like, if you have the narrative, then you can repeat, practice something like a drill over and over and over or whatever.
Yeah,
without its split.
Yeah, I'm going to go back into language for this, which helps explain why I think both are important because it's already been explained really well by others. But I can't sit down to write a story if I don't have a good grasp of vocabulary or grammar. Vocabulary and grammar are rote learning. If you ever try to learn a foreign language, that's the first darn thing you do is like, the green thing that grows off a tree and I sometimes can put it in a pie. What is that? Manzana. Okay, great. It's an apple. So you need to learn these, like, I call them Lego blocks. You need to learn these structured Lego blocks before you can get into the narrative of how they get put together to make a TIE fighter or the Millennium Falcon or, or a real, atajo to thrust. Did that answer the question, or did I get carried away again?
No, I like it. I want to poke Tim with a stick a little bit on this question of rote versus theory-based learning, and because he translated the Godinho text, so I want to kind of feel out where does Godinho lie on that continuum between the medieval sort of rote learning style, make me 50 pots or make me 1,000 pots, versus a theory-based approach.
I think he's definitely more on the rote. If anybody's read his book knows that there's almost nothing in there in theory, and so a lot of what I had to struggle with because I'm a very theoretical kind of learner, and so I've had a rough time trying to understand him. I had to put his take everything that he puts in there and kind of build a structure and piece it apart in order to understand the theory behind it or to surmise what the theory is behind it. And it's just not there. And, you can, anybody who's studied Montante knows, you've got the rules. He's also got his rules for 2 swords. And then some of the other single sword stuff, he also has rules on some of his basic stuff. So it's very much, it seems to be, because he doesn't really talk about how to teach, but it seems to be that it's very much just do this. This is what you're told, just do it, and you'll understand it later.
Thanks, Tim. That's really helpful. So I think I have a place I want to delve on this a little bit, but this idea about the difference between theory-based learning, which it seems like Carranza leans heavily into it. Well, I don't think we have to question that. I think we can just state it. Versus the Pachacista framework, right? So one of the things Pacheco does is he throws down a lot of structure where Carranza was really loosey-goosey. Now, it's not entirely fair because Carranza did not write a fencing manual. He wrote a meta-fencing text. I think we can make that argument. But Pacheco comes in and he lays down all this structure, which is really memorizable for that rote learning style. But he's not leaving the theory behind either. So is this something that makes Pacheco more attractive? Or could we make the argument that a more strongly theory-based approach is Karen's sign, while rote learning is much more Pachacista? Because there's plenty of places I think where you can argue that Pacheco is rote-based. So what do we think about that?
I would have
The thing
thought.
is,
Go ahead.
I mean, the thing that's difficult about that question is that we're kind of looking at our sources, and what they wrote doesn't necessarily tell us how they taught. Because the books that we're looking at were more, codifications of systems or systems of thought. And we can't really know for sure, whether Pacheco was using narrative to teach this material or relying on rote drill or what he was doing, because most of this is, more, here's what the system is, here's what you should do, not a lot of like, I mean, there's discussion of the why, but there's not discussion of the how so much, because they didn't write that down. We didn't see that in the living, breathing, day-to-day instruction in that we're interpreting from the historical manuals.
I can only speak from a limited number of authors, but I think it's interesting that Figueiredo, who I feel is fairly Karen-seen, absolutely rails, at least in the offhand section, that he will absolutely not put in a whole bunch of ways to increase his word count and increase the cost of his book. He's not going to give you plays. He's going to give you the theory, and you can work it out from the theory alone. And I don't know offhand how many authors talk about that.
That's actually one of the reasons why I focused on Viedma, because he wrote a book specifically on this is how you teach, and it's even like in the subtitle of his book, how one person can teach another person without having a maestro, and he does front load a lot of theory into it, but when it gets to the actual instruction, it's almost become a joke now, where it's like, here's line and cross, do that over and over and over for 8 days, and then eventually, I'll teach you something else. So at least with that one, I mean, we also have Pacheco's Moto Faster, which is just kind of like an examination. It's not really, this is how you train it. So as far as I can remember, Viedma is the only one who explicitly talks about this is how you train it, and he does have that rote learning there, where he says to just do one thing over and over and over until you naturalize these movements, and then you'll understand it. Because a lot of times, like people have talked about before, you need the physical and the theoretical kind of inform each other, and you can only go so far in one without the other, and sometimes you just need a context for one or the other. So sometimes, like I said, I'm very theoretical. So sometimes when I'm teaching students, I tend to go too far. Some of them love it. They want to know the theory, they want to understand the why, and they need that. But I've had other ones that just like shake their head and wave their hands and say, no, Tim, shut up. Just tell me what to do. Because that's what they want. They just want to be told what to do. They'll understand it later, because right now it's all just gibberish too. They need some sort of context for how this thing works or how it applies. And that's one of the things that Viedma talks about a lot, is that you need to do this, you need to reduce this to practice, you need to do this, and it will uncover these other things that the theory talks about, but you're not going to understand it until you actually do get these movements into your body to where they become natural.
I think that's really good. One of the things I think about Pacheco specifically is the way that he organizes the tradition. It's a dead ringer for the way that classical fencing is organized. And in some ways, I think he's even superior to some of the fencing theory that we have today, but he's got a structure for the tradition. So it's well understood, like what are attacks, what are defenses, what is timing theory, movement theory. He's got a really coherent way of putting this all together, which I think is really useful. I know he gets a lot of grief, but the way that he took something which seemed really nebulous from Carranza and organized it is really good. Now, we're not really certain if that's all his, but if you look at Thibault also like did a lot of that organizing work. And he looks pretty sophisticated as well. I wish Matthew was here today because he could probably talk about it a little better. So maybe the question here, since we seem to think that both rote learning and theory have its place, is this a progression that the student needs? From a newcomer, maybe we have different needs that we might have different needs as a newcomer as opposed to being an advanced student. Is that a consensus or is there disagreement?
Well, that, and also I think that falls in what is the goal of the new fencer? Is the goal for the student to become a strong fighter, combatant, or is their goal eventually to become a teacher as well? If if their goal is to eventually teach others, the theory is much more important than if you're training soldiers who are mainly learning so they can go fight the Dutch and the Turks. I'm kind of wondering now, thinking just from the conversation on that earlier point about different education systems, with Godinho, how much may be also impacted by the intended audience for a particular book, where my sense, and Tim, feel free to correct me on this, is Godinho to an extent is writing more for the common soldier and not necessarily the gentleman who has the university education. Whereas Carranza would be looking more to that person reading his books. And then with Pacheco writing for people who will be fencing masters as well. Are they going more theory-based given that audience?
Thanks, Ernesto. I'm going to call out Alish specifically because I see some stuff going on in the chat here. So if you are okay with it, I'd like you to unmute and talk to us a little bit about Rada. We've been talking about the difference between a more medieval style way of learning where the student memorizes technique and through that they sort of discover the theory, as opposed to the Renaissance approach where there's a large theory introduction and then you start to learn the technique. So Alicia, if you could place Rada on that scale and maybe give us some ideas about how he approaches teaching.
I'm not 100% sure about this because he gives us the drills, but he also has a lot of explanations about how to think about your defense. Like he has this very strange image where there is a Renaissance star fort and the Diestro is on top, and you should imagine your defense as the walls of the fortress. So he has some strange combination, and I'm not sure how much is for the teacher or how much is for the student. But at least he does give you the start with the simple straight steps, then we have the curved steps, then we do the simple attacks. Then we do the simple attacks with different steps and so on. So he does give you the lessons. But as the book goes on, he seems to maybe forget about it or think that, okay, you've done the basics, so now you can do the advanced stuff, and here are the plays, and you can figure out what each play tries to teach you. This is not as explicit about that, I think. But you can, if you look at the plays, you can see like 3 very similar plays. You throw acometimiento to use our stellar example, and depending on if the parry goes slightly up, or if it's to the side, or if it's maybe down, then he tells you to do the estocada sajita under the arm, or throw a revés, or a tajo, or whatever else. But he's not explicit about things. It's a bit practice this, and you'll see the difference, I guess. I don't know if that answers the question well.
I think it does. It's interesting because the thing I remember about Rada is he does have a lot of drills. So he seems to fall a little more on the road side. But I'm curious if he has a lot of theory explanation or hows and whys.
He does, and especially in book 1, I skipped because it's too philosophical for me, I guess. But book 2 has definitions, and all the right angle reaches more than the other angles, and your sword is stronger, closer to your hand, and so on. And perhaps dubious demonstrations about why these things are, but he does explain a lot. He also explains how to draw the circle with compass and straight edge and a bunch of other stuff. But I'm not sure if he wants you to take a new student and have them learn all that and then start to practice, or if that's for the teacher to understand, and then they can teach in a more practical way. I don't think he forces anything on you. He gives you the practical drills, and you can add more theory if you want, or you can just have them practice and learn fencing.
That's good. Thanks. I appreciate that.
I have a somewhat tangential question here. So a lot of us have learned things from books without necessarily having a teacher there. But as a teacher, there are certain things that we're constantly pointing out, correcting, and nudging in our students, right? And that is things like, don't have a wooden timing, you got to change timing, pay attention to this, pay attention to that. And it's pretty much a running thing that goes, all of class, all year sort of thing. So how does that fit into, for you, learning just from a book? Like maybe a book and a friend, right? At what point is that like rote? And you're responsible then for your own, mistakes or poorly done actions. Then you have to discover later that there's a better way of doing it.
Well, I don't think this is something you can be taught by a book, really. Like maybe with video and an explanation you could do something, but I think you have to go through the plays, try the plays, see what works and what doesn't. Rada might give you some little advice about you should be quick about this and make sure that these actions happen at the same time and stuff like that. But there's only so much you can do with text, I think.
But we look at Carranza and Pacheco, all these authors, right? And they released books to, the entire peninsula, right? They weren't directly teaching people. Sure, Pacheco was having like all the fencing masters retest, but a lot of these were being picked up by people who they may have had other fencing experience, but they were new to this.
Yes, and you can see that they also often talk about the aficionados, which I guess is a word in English too. They seem to expect people who don't know fencing or don't know it very well to pick up the books and learn something from them. So I can say I know enough about the society back then to really say how much this happened, or if everybody knew enough to make sense of the books. But I guess we have the forgotten Quevedo making fun of Pacheco because people don't understand his book, even if it was a good book. So maybe there's something there.
So I want to pivot the discussion to something that Jeanette brought up, which I think is interesting, and maybe we can collectively workshop this problem. One of the problems with rote learning is that if somebody introduces disorder into your situation, the rote learning can collapse when you get unexpected inputs. So how would we as teachers in this tradition, or as students trying to improve our own performance, how do we solve that problem? How do we learn to color outside the lines?
John, you want an example of that disordered stuff? Because you're muted, John.
Yeah,
There you
like what? Give us an example of like what you would consider like what kind of disorder you're
Okay.
talking about.
So this is actually in the first dialogue. It's, I think, in the section that I just released. And the definition of something incredibly disordered is given as, if you're fighting someone and all they do is retreat very quickly backwards, there is no destreza to defeat that because there is no order, there is no rhyme or reason to what they are doing. And then I feel like the text kind of contradicts itself, or the character contradicts himself by saying, but you can figure out how to defeat this by paying attention to how he moves, by understanding that if one leg is in a particular and has a strength, then another part of his body is going to have a weakness, and you can take advantage of that. So from my perspective, and I feel kind of like I'm cheating because I read that part of the text fairly closely at this point. It's about if somebody, like we've got a couple of people dancing scene in Australia that, well, in Brisbane, that have no rhyme or reason to what they do. And they're incredibly frustrating to fight because they'll do, you know, like if you throw a thrust, instead of them blocking the thrust as any sensible human would do, they try to beat you to the punch and hit you in the head when it's clearly going to be a double. You know, if you've been trained that what you want to do is defend yourself first, that's not a possibility in your decision tree. So to me, the warning in the book, the warning that Charilau or Karilau gives is, when you are faced with someone who doesn't make sense, stop relying on your rote and start paying attention to what they're doing and respond immediately in time to their nonsense.
So there we go. I mean, that's like we're starting to drill down into the problem. How? Right?
Right, and that is
Yeah,
the question,
like,
right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
So I find that people who come to fencing with previous martial arts experience have a lot easier time with that. You know, even if they just came like from the military, like from the army, they teach them combatives and stuff like that. They have a much higher baseline for how to improvise against someone who does something weird. Someone who doesn't have that background, it is a harder skill to learn, but not impossible.
So locally for our Italian practices, we get a good way of going over this just because most of everybody's SCA, which is the mecca for people who will do weird shit at you.
Right.
Which then often leads to, okay, we demonstrate something, show something, and then, well, what do we do about what this guy's doing? Okay, let's figure out what does he do? Now, how do we apply the theory to what he's doing? Okay, here's where those openings are to apply it. Okay, what about these people? because you can't do an Tahoe on them because they're back here in Gunslinger. Okay, then
Yeah,
you do
right.
this. So it's often turns for us. Luckily, we have lots of good examples for different types of goofy stuff. To okay, now we're going to workshop how to apply this to that particular goofy thing.
Right.
Well, this also kind of takes us into the territory of like where vulgar can be true. You know, if we're looking at the causes and really assessing what they're doing, we're not obligated to respond according to, you know, fundamental Destreza principle, like true school principles, if true school principles are not being engaged with and are not applicable to our situation. So then we have to look outside of that and go, okay, what's in front of me and what do I need to do to stab it? And that's where vulgar becomes true.
But when the
I
causes
disagree. I think that
Here.
the principles are true, then they're universal. If we have to drop those principles to meet the chaotic, then our system is a fraud. However, we do need to adapt those principles to the causes that are presented to us. Use the foundational principles of the system to control the chaos and impose the order we want rather than accepting the chaos that they're throwing at us.
I don't think it means that our system is a fraud, but what our system is something that was designed at a specific time under specific circumstances to deal with a generally consistent set of conditions. But there's times where, you know, like if you're fencing someone who's radically far from historical fencing, they're going to be pretty far outside the sort of operating conditions of the day for which Destreza was designed. And so there might be time, you know, because like Destreza canon is your stance is upright. But you know, you might be fencing someone where that upright posture just doesn't allow you to move in the way that you need to move in order to adapt and in order to confront what's in front of you. And that's where like you have to start varying from, you know, true school, you know, humanistic descended cut and dried geometric philosophy, because that's going to get you killed if you keep doing it. So I don't think it's that it's a fraud. I think it's that it's a product of its time, like everything else, and you have to really look at the circumstances, which I think is actually the heart of Destreza thinking. I think Destreza, like to me anyway, Destreza thinking isn't really locked into any particular time or place or circumstance. It's a way of perceiving and evaluating and acting using established tools that we know the parameters of, but being flexible in applying them anywhere in that continuum of where the medio can be found.
So John,
what you're saying is not that you want to abandon the principles, but abandon the techniques that have illustrated those principles against ideal opponents.
Yes, but I think there's also, I mean, I think it probably also depends on which master you're talking to as far as like what's acceptable deviation or not. And I think you get different answers on that from different people. But I wouldn't say that, I would say that that's true, yes.
I think you're right, John. We have some masters who might call people heretics for one thing that others would accept. But I think when we look at the whole tradition, what we have is a set of examples or contexts that the system is worked out and applied to. And when we fence someone, they may or may not fit into one of those contexts that's already, you know, well played out and described and taught and everything. So, you know, we see new authors adding to the canon or whatever because they've got a new context or a new take on something, right? That's all valuable. But there's a certain amount that we just have to do in the moment when we're fencing, but still apply the basics, right? Just new context.
So we're having a good discussion, but we still haven't solved our students' problem, right? I know what Eric and I would do to solve this problem, but I don't want to let the cat out of the bag on that one. Let me give you a specific example from teaching Italian fencing. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so teaching finding the sword, which is basically a Tahoe for people who haven't seen the light yet. And so you cover the adversary's sword, and there are different things that they can do, right? They can back up, or they can try to do a disengagement, or they can sit there and do nothing, right? So we taught students to cover the sword, and then we taught them responses to those inputs. What we did not anticipate was that our students would get out there and they would go out into the wild, vulgar landscape, and there would be morons there who had no idea what having their sword covered would mean. And so the morons would attack into the closed line. And our students were so stupefied by the idiocy of this adversary's response. Why would you attack a line which I have closed entirely? That they sort of froze like deer in the headlights. They had this enormous advantage and power, and they just weren't using it. So we solved that by training that input. But there's a lot of different inputs out there. How do we solve the mess, or how do we at least make it better?
The principles are narrow their choices. Step off of the diameter and you only have to defend half the target you were giving them when they were on the diameter. Maintain the medio de proportion, and you have time to deal with whatever they throw at you.
So your way of handling mess is reduce choice. Is that what I'm getting?
Yes.
Yeah. That's pretty classic Hicks law, where you reduce choice, or reduce inputs so that you can be artificially faster. What else have we got?
I think there's also a consideration of how causes change. In pretty much any time we're fighting, since we are not fighting in the context of the masters, we have to consider what are the goals of the opponent. You know, it kind of the modern fencing, really, sport fencing, the goal is closing the electrical circuit. So once you have flick attacks, that's going to change how to actually apply the principles. Once you're on a strip, that's going to change what you can do. So when you look at that weirdness, you also have to look at that weirdness in the context of what are the goals of the competition, too. Does that make sense, or am I completely off?
No, you're making an argument for fencing based on the causes. And if the cause is sport-based, then things are going to change naturally.
I think there's an important point that he's bringing up, which is that you have to be able to identify what the causes are, what the goal is, in wildly different cases than what you're used to training.
I want to drag in something that Lois introduced, which is the concept of narrative. It can be applied to a fight as well. A fight has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you try to jump straight from your start into the middle, you don't know what those causes are. The combat has to begin by exploring, asking the question, who is my opponent? Only at that point can you apply your principles to known causes and reach the end that you want.
And we've sort of had this discussion before, where we take out Aristotle's four causes and sort of try to line them up on our adversary to get a model of how that fight can go. It's a little esoteric, but as a practice, I think it's useful. It still doesn't give us. So let's refine our problem a little bit. We are an instructor. collectively we're all like separate personalities inside this instructor's head, and our goal is to get the student to be able to handle variable inputs, right? We need a practical pedagogical way to do this. We're just kind of talking about theory and things like that, but what are the actual things that we can do with our student to help them solve this problem?
Well, I think, like, looking at it pedagogically, one of the things you can do is map the possibilities. And this kind of ties back into what Ken was saying and back into the idea of like decision trees, is that if you put in a Tahoe on someone, there's only so many things that can happen after that. You know, they're going to move their weapon, they're going to, you know, resist you, they're going to move away from you, they're going to charge through, and you can map those possibilities and then drill by rote responses to each of those possibilities. So you could set up a pedagogical framework that way, so that, like, you know, here's our 3 or 4 responses to what's possible from an Tahoe on the inside line, and do it that way.
Eric, you made a point in the chat. I think you should just bring that out and talk about it a little bit.
So I think we start seeing it in the mid-classical period for Italian fencing, and I think we see it in other traditions also, but I'm just used to the Italians. There's this thing called synoptic tables, and basically it's, you know, here's the things that you can do in a given situation, and here are the responses to that. And so, depending on whose system and how detailed, yeah, these different things. So depending on how detailed you're going and how many actions deep you're going, this can be anything from like 1 page to, I think Chris Holzman is looking at one now that's like 70 pages of synoptic tables, something like that. It's crazy.
He hasn't run away from that text.
But it's it's interesting, right? I mean, it really explores everything, like all the possibilities, right? You can't really forget it because it's systematic, right? It's like, here's your attacks, right? Here's your openings. How do they mesh? You know, you don't just go through and like, oh, well, it's this thing, and then get distracted going down one line. You've got this whole table to fill out. So,
one thing I found with them, I absolutely love synoptic tables through the classical program. That I found them very hard to use in a book format because they are spread, like you said, across 70 pages or so. But I went through William Gogler's Science of Fencing, took his and converted them to an Excel file. And now in modern times, those of us who work with Excel, if you have them in that format, being able to sort and shade lets you see patterns that you would never spot otherwise, that are really amazing in really giving you an essence of a system.
So you're saying Excel spreadsheets of fencing actions is the new hotness?
That's my life 9 to 5. So to me, that's really easy to follow as a thought process. Hopefully a lot of other fencers are spared that for the rest of their lives. But at least for those of us who have to live in Excel, I found it a really good way of systematizing school.
That's really lovely. I want to nudge Caden into this discussion because I know he's lurking. But Caden, are you comfortable answering the question? He's unmuted, but he's not necessarily saying that he's comfortable. So Caden, if you have somebody who's starting to progress as a student and you want to keep them entertained in a lesson, you know that the drill exists. Are there things that you might do with an advanced student that you wouldn't do with somebody who's just beginning? We can't hear you if you're talking, Caden. Oh, Caden's mic doesn't work. Ah, very convenient.
Cause-based approach.
How's that for your disorder?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll toss this to John then, since you've also been in the same situation.
Can you state the question again, please?
You weren't listening. No, okay. So
I was absorbed with the chat.
Oh, okay. You've got a student who knows the drill, right? And you want to keep them engaged because they're a little more advanced. What are the things that you as the instructor can do to keep both you and the student engaged and entertained, and also scratch that itch that you need to scratch as far as disordered action?
Oh, definitely. The thing that advanced students have done with me that I've found very disordering is to start just randomly throwing in changes to the drill. And that happens a lot, actually, working with certain advanced fencers in our school where, and it was really frustrating to me at first, actually, because there's a part of me that just wants to like do it until I get it. But right from the get-go, Scott did this a lot where he would just like throw something random, or he wouldn't do what the drill was, or leave out a move, or, you know, wait for me to actually hit instead of, you know, seeing if I would actually follow through on my attack and things like that. And I think that's, while it's really frustrating when you don't expect it, or it's not like what you're looking for at that moment, it's super effective, and it's actually very authentic in terms of like the unpredictability and training yourself to deal with what's going to be happening in an assault. So that would be like the number one thing I think I would do, would be to, you know, just start. I would probably frame it with the student before I started doing it and just say, okay, it looks like you've got the technique now. I'm going to start, you know, trying to block you, and then you have to respond. And I'm going to do it sometimes, but not, you know, lay it out for them in a framework and just kind of extend the drill by another element that way, to throw that element of randomness in it. And of course, you know, you can just expand on that, you know, until the evening is over. But that seems like a good way to do that.
Yeah, that's what we tend to do with more advanced students, is we introduce an element of play and some randomness. Especially, I'm not really the one to do it. Eric would probably be a better choice for this, but things like when I'm coming forward into an attack and somebody defends, what about this thing that tall people do where they bend their arm like this to get around the parry? Right? If you, yeah, look at them all laugh, right? How do you deal with that? Right? Now, in order for me to do that, I have to pick up like a 45-inch weapon, but fencers need to know how to deal with that, because tall people do those things. They will sacrifice their own self-defense, or suicidal fencers. I'm certainly good at that. Suicidal fencers will sacrifice their defense to try to get the touch. So I think introducing elements of chaos in a form that could be considered play is a great way to keep intermediate and advanced students engaged, even with basic drills.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun, you know, once you get into that rhythm, like, oh, it doesn't actually feel like rote drilling anymore. It feels like we're actually kind of, you know, doing something. But the other thing that's good about it is it's kind of that principle that we have in our school of, you know, take a lesson, give a lesson, because it requires the person in the instructor role to be a little more dynamic, rather than just kind of like going through and delivering your student the exact same movement every time, which is, you know, you could do that in your sleep at a certain point, but it's better not to sleep. It's better to like use your awareness and train your own perception and action as you're training somebody else's. So it goes both ways, and it can be really valuable and can make it a lot more fun for the student and for the instructor.
Sometimes I'll ask myself at the end of an action, like I'll feed somebody who's really pretty good at this, like straight attacks, no wrinkles. And then I'll ask myself as we're going, how would I defeat it? Right. And maybe that last action, boom, I'll give them something a little different.
That's one thing that I like to do when we're, you know, at the end of a drill and we've kind of, when I'm with a student and we've done it, it's like, okay, we got that. I like to take it to the next step and say, okay, let's take it into the second intention, or, you know, what would happen if instead of, you know, doing this, I did that. Okay, well, let's play with it now and just kind of take the same concept but extend it into a different scenario where you're not really you're not really throwing that randomness element into it, but you're extending the thinking of the drill into something where you're imagining the drill in a context larger than just, the single action or single sequence of the drill.
Yeah, I'm kind of breaking the rules here a little bit because I'm jumping in and sort of answering about how we would do stuff. So I want to pivot away from like my approach or Eric's approach, even though I haven't let him talk about it at all. I want to see, like Tim, you've done a lot of instructing work in other traditions as well. Can I get your take on this?
It seemed like there was a lot of topics. Can you narrow it down?
Sure. So practical hands-on techniques for helping the student get out of rote technique and being able to be more responsive to dynamic changes in a fight.
Yeah, I mean, I generally do it the way that that other people have said. I rather than kind of throwing out different, like injecting some kind of randomness, a lot of times I like to kind of take on a persona of a different type of fighter, and think, okay, you've got this down, so now I'm going to be that guy who's suicidal, or somebody who really likes to play counterpuncher, or somebody who likes to kind of run away, and just to throw them off, to make them have to adapt to a different type of fighter. So I'll just run through different types of fighters that I can think of, or different things that I've seen, or different methods that I know of, in order to give them something different. Because a lot of times you get kind of stuck in whichever style that you're teaching or you're training. There's an ideal way of moving, of attacking, defending, whatever. There's an ideal of how this is how things should be done. And so as a part of that, you tend to get stuck with defending or countering other people who also do things the same way, rather than people who are not the same way. So that's something I try to prevent or guard against. So as soon as somebody starts getting a little bit too comfortable defending against people that they're used to, then if I can't bring in somebody from another school or another style, or just somebody that's going to throw them off, then I'll just play that role and take it over for them, and just basically be an asshole to my students, really, is what it comes down to.
That raises an important point. If you are changing the drill without telling the student, you're risking losing their trust in you. If the time comes that you have to shuffle the deck, it can be better to preface it by saying, all right, now you are getting it. What would you do if somebody were to start doing something different than this sequence? And then throw that in once they know it's coming.
I'm probably going to disagree with you a little bit there, Kim, but I want to draw a distinction between the changes that you might make. So if I've got somebody who's starting to like crowd from that beginner space into that intermediate space, I may throw them changes without any warning, and they might fail in the drill. But then when I do it, I'll consistently show them the same thing. Like, tell me, how would you beat it, right? So it's not. There's a big difference between doing that and allowing them to see something new without warning, and then work through solving that puzzle and changing the drill so that I get to be the winner. Because I really feel pretty strongly that as an instructor, I don't need to be the winner of the drill, right? That's really not going to be helpful. But showing somebody a little bit of chaos and letting them deal with it in a sort of an organized way, I think that's much more useful. So I don't think that we're disagreeing, but I'm just sort of adding a little bit of distinction there.
Yeah, I was going to mention something like that as well, right? So it's not like adding chaos isn't like a ride through amber or something, right? It's not this spastic mix of things in. It's just enough changes so that you're pushing the student's envelope, right? They're comfortable, and then you throw something in that makes them a little uncomfortable, and then you back off a little bit. So you just want to push that edge a little bit, right? But the classic one that we tend to start with is if there's a drill where the student is engaging the sword or a tahoe, you just free the blade before they pick it up, right? And then they have to try again, and then they finish the action. Right? And it's not this like endless cycle of like, oh, I avoided it, ha, I avoided it, ha, I avoided it. Unless you want to be real annoying to your student. But
Love that example.
it's like do that, on occasion, right? And then they're getting the sense that like they have to make sure they get it before they step forward, right? And then at a more advanced level, then it's going to be something else. Like I'm going to do this other thing instead of what we were just practicing. But it's with people that you already have a relationship with and who've been taught to expect certain boundaries and what that introduced chaos is.
Yeah, and because we're teaching teachers a lot of the time, one of the things that we will do is we will go to our instructor and we'll tell them, look, this is the problem that your student is having. They're doing this behavior. Tell me what you would change in what you're doing right now to solve it. So if somebody's like taking the Tahoe and just blasting in, right, then letting them think they're about to get the Tahoe and then evading it with a semicircle of the wrist, that's going to teach them real quick not to step forward until that Tahoe is locked in, because they'll walk right onto the point. We love that one. It's hilarious on the instructor side. And you get a couple of those and you're going to be a lot more careful about locking your Tahoe down.
Yeah, I think the disagreement is entirely semantic.
I also want to hear from Alesh about introducing randomness, because I know that you're doing a lot of teaching too. So if you could talk about it a little bit, I'd be interested in hearing your approach.
So I'm teaching more longsword than rapier because everybody thinks that the sword is cooler. But I think a big point with this is that if you're doing the basic mechanics, you should do the basic mechanics and not start doing random stuff that will confuse the student. But when you're doing let's say a traditional fencing lesson, and you're working on a tahoe or whatever, it's fine to throw some random stuff in there because it's the lesson, and you should keep it somewhat real. And if you're not going all out because you're the teacher, but like say you're doing a tahoe but you disengage, that's fine. That's something they need to expect, and their tahoe needs to be good enough that the disengage is not too easy, and so on. So it is something I would do. I would not do it on the first day because they will not know what to do. So just stick to the level of your student, and it's fine. And as you said, Puck, you do one thing, and if they fail, you work it out. You don't just keep throwing random stuff in there. You let them figure out things and help them if they need the help. And I don't think anybody is going to mistrust you after that. You just know they have to be awake and pay attention, and things may come, but you're still a teacher who will help them get through things. It's not a problem, I think.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. That was really good. Because I think we use the first lessons to establish trust, and then as soon as they're comfortable, we immediately betray that trust. But we do it in a way that will help them start to solve this problem of uncertainty. Yeah, I like that a lot.
And on that matter of uncertainty, I think a big problem with Destreza is when we train among each other, we get very used to holding a right angle and doing a tahoe, etc. And we may fail to recognize situations that are equivalent, but not identical. So it's very important to have your students fight people who do Italian or just rapier epee or whatever else, so they can learn. Like whenever someone lunges at me, that's pretty much the same as someone standing in a right angle, just that they're getting close. So I can put a tajo on that lunge or anything of the sort.
Yeah, that's really important too. I agree. And I think that's part of the tradition's legacy, because Carranza and Pacheco are both really well read of other authors, so they're really aware of the fencing going on in the world around them, and they address it specifically. So I think part of our Destreza legacy is to understand the fencing that's going on that's not part of our school and be ready for it.
Yes, and also I'd say that we may have to play Italian or Bulgar at times, since you cannot train or you cannot learn to defend against something if nobody ever does it to you. So if you don't train at the club and you go to some competition and then people start doing things, you'll have a hard time. So as a teacher, it may pay off to do the crazy lunges and pasata soto and whatever else we can think about. Just that so the students get used to it, even if you can think that the solution is in the tradition anyway, but making it explicit, it's important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think just by show of hands for the people that are visible in the chat, how many of you guys pretend to be Italians or something else when you're teaching this tradition? I think, it's something that we all try to do, and it's a really good point. We have just about 5 to 10 more minutes left, but I'm curious about other thoughts that you have, Alish. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I was just going to say that since half my students don't do what I tell them to do, I have an easy time having Italians and Bulgars in the club, so no problems for me there.
It's hilarious. So one of the things I think about Destreza is I also try to have a set of techniques that I draw on for uncertainty. So whenever I lose a sense of where the adversary is going to go, I move from atajos, which I think of as fairly linear, into circular actions, like the generals. I use the generals to collect garbage. And I think that Rada does something really similar with his higher atajos, because he goes in to find the atajo, and if he finds it weak in the bind or escaping, he will move to a circle to collect. So I think the generals used defensively, those spiraling actions can be really powerful, and they can help us with uncertainty.
Yes, I agree. And like with Rada, everything is atajo, and you will do. But it makes it very simple. If the sword is in presence, you put atajo on it. If it's not in presence, you put atajo virtual on it. That's about it. Then you move to medio proporcional, and then, well, it depends. If they try to attack you, you can put real atajo if the sword wasn't in presence. If they try to move out of your atajo, then you can continue in some way. But if they try to disengage, you have the circular movements, which, as you say, they collect garbage very well. And I think even modern fencers will agree on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The classical circular parries, they are like God's own garbage collector. They will just clean up almost everything, but they're big. So if you see them coming, you can get around them. Other thoughts on uncertainty? So I know that John and Caden are certainly going to use generals to collect mess, but how do other people address it? Like Lois in the Brisbane school, do you guys have a plan for uncertainty like that?
Not explicitly. It's not something that we have in this. it's discussed to a degree in our theory of everything class, which I think is at the end of our either novice or apprentice. I think it is. But it's where, we'll do things and then we'll discuss the Destreza concepts around it. So somebody talking about, well, what about a disordered opponent? Then you might address it. But for the most part, talking about fighting a disordered opponent happens with students and instructors in the school who are already in the tournament scene and have to deal with those handful of people who like to do random shit at you, thinking that they're actually doing technique and they're not. So we actually cover that, not in the earlier stages. And that's a thought. Maybe we should.
Personally, I think there needs to be more in-class drill time with pocket sand because that's the answer. Straight out of Godinho, I mean.
Well, if I properly form my atajo, I can actually atajo the pocket sand.
And if you're going up against the cape, Godinho advises you to have a second pocket of sand so that when the capist puts his cape up and defends himself from the sand, you can throw a second hand at it.
Is that Marx Brothers School of Fencing, or is that more Three Stooges?
Three Stooges is the no, I won't. I don't want to fight you. Poke you in the eyes.
It's great because you can feel the resentment. You can feel the resentment in Godinho's words. He's like, if you're the kind of person who gets night or day around corners by people wanting to ambush you, here are things you can do.
There's a really obscure little one I found ages ago. It's an Italian text, Quieto, I think, which is more of a traveler's guide, but it only has 2 fighting pieces to it, which are basically if you get jumped in the street. And his rapier and dagger section is one of my favorite things. You basically stick your rapier under your left shoulder, take your dagger up, throw him at it, and when he dodges the dagger, tape your rapier and stab him. And if you don't have a dagger, pull out your sword and fling your scabbard at him, and when he dodges that, stab him. That's all. That's his entire fight theory.
And I've known that to work.
Mm-hmm.
I have to wonder if learning to throw with the left hand would be useful here.
Right.
Could be, yeah. I mean, I think all of that traces back to Porthos, but...
Riding Hobbs' pony.
Mm-hmm.
Or has to run away.
Yeah. Got a couple more minutes. What are some other examples of some drills that you would do in your schools? Like at our school, we tend to have 2 lines, and half of the students have the role of an instructor, who's the one who always gets hit in the end, and the other half is the student. And then partway through, they reverse roles, right? So they're all going to do the same thing. We've talked a little bit about how we would act as an instructor. But for those of you who don't have that same student and instructor role for all your drills, what sort of things do you do? Or how would you get your students to introduce some other little bit of chaos to the system?
I'm not muted. Okay. So I try to use non-cooperative drills, so the winner is not decided. Mm-hmm. So this avoids people becoming robots, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And one I like, for example, is for atajo, and we'll have one has to put atajo and thrust in opposition, and the other has to disengage and thrust without opposition.
Right.
So you'll have one student trying to chase the atajo and the other trying to avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
This is pretty real in a way, since people tend to not like you to put attack on them, and they can really try to win the drill, and it's fine if the students are of a similar level, of course. You have to watch out and not put a complete newbie with somebody very experienced, or well, it's fine too if the experienced guy acts like the teacher. But it's better if they're of a similar skill.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me the thing is try to use competitive drills so they can go all out, so to speak, and have their own chaos.
I've used that a lot in the past as well. Do you let them both know what the other's goal is, or do you tell them secretly?
For this, it's explicit, and usually they'll do it for a while and then switch roles.
Okay.
So
Anyone
we
else
run-
have something like that? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So it just reminds me, Jake Norwood had some workshops he did at Racine that for his longsword side. He calls them hopped games, where it's asymmetric wills, such as one person can only attack high lines, the other one can only attack low, or one person can only throw thrusts and the other person can only do cuts, to work on defending against things you don't usually do. And trying to think out, against people who don't fight the way you do. I hadn't thought about applying it to Destreza, but now I'm going to be doing that.
Sometimes in the bouting after class, we will assign goals based on the exercises. So especially for the more advanced students where, for example, you need to use an acometamiento to strike with a thrust in second intention, or you need to set up a acometamiento with a thrust and then roll off the parry into a cut or a half cut to get your goal for the night. So we sometimes set up fencing goals where the exercise is to execute a fencing technique with a little bit of difficulty in bouting.
The only one I can think of that is deliberately chaotic is to play off of unarmed work with sticky hands and play at sticky swords, which develops tactile sensitivity.
I like it. So we are past 8 o'clock, and my goodness, that was a really good discussion. A lot of depth, especially about like rote versus theory-based. And I think we're sort of at a consensus that there needs to be a medio between those two. So next week, we sort of pitched this a little bit, but next week I'm going to take deliver a lecture on how Sacramento Sword School uses classical fencing pedagogy to teach Destreza, and laying that on top of some of Carranza's ideas and some of Pacheco's structure, and how does that work, and what are the things that we do to help students put that together. So hopefully that'll be interesting. It will be, we're going to bring back some of the lecturers who've already spoken about different topics. So hopefully that'll be good. All right, great talk, everybody. I will hopefully see you guys all next week, and be safe. We will get through the strangeness in our world. 2020 won't last forever.
Great.
Thank you to all of you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.